emergency or progress. Sorry, I should come back here. A planet in emergency or progress. And I'd like to welcome, please could you make a little less noise for our speakers? Akshat Rathi, who's a reporter for Bloomberg News, and his first book, Climate Capitalism, has been named as one of the best books of the year by the Times and the Economic Times. He's also edited a book of essays from young climate leaders. Lynne Jones. Lynne Jones, OBE, is a child psychiatrist, aid worker and writer who consults for WHO and UNICEF. Over the past 30 years, she has dedicated herself to establishing mental health programs in conflict and disaster areas around the world, many of which are climate-related. She's also the acclaimed author of works such as Outside the Asylum, The Migrant Diaries, Then They Started Shooting, and Sorry for the Inconvenience, but This is an Emergency. And her diaries have been featured in many other media. And the session is to be moderated by Aneysha Minocha, who trained as an architect and is currently the founder and CEO of Quant Energy, driving climate investment in commercial property portfolios. She was born and grew up in India, where she studied, though she's lived in India for in the UK for 25 years. So welcome on board. You're quite happy with the usual format, 45 minutes and 15 for questions, which you'll chair, and then I'll come and wind up for you. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Nilofer, Rahul, and the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival for having us here today. This is a pertinent topic. India's been burning in the heat wave this week, as we all probably are aware. We have a really interesting panel session today. The three of us bringing three different lenses on the same subject, on the matter of climate emergency. We're going to have the activist, Lynne Jones, the journalist and capitalist, Akshat Rathi, and the entrepreneur, that's me. We'll be talking about the climate emergency and are we making enough progress? Is this an emergency? Have we got the solutions? So we've had a fantastic introduction from Rachel, so I won't go over the introductions again. I'm going to jump straight into climate change and capitalism, which refers to the book that Akshat's written, which is Climate Capitalism. So my first question is for Akshat. How should we be defining capitalism? You talk about climate and capitalism coexisting. Tell me more.
I try and, in the book, make the case for what are the sets of solutions that we need to try and tackle the problem. And not just that it's a theoretical framework, but that there are places around the world where those solutions are being deployed. And as I was reporting on them, they happen to be almost all of them under a capitalist system. And so I wanted to find out what makes it possible within a capitalist economy, which if we define as a profit-driven economic system that has private ownership, so people benefit from profits, but is always regulated within a government system, and if not, then by nature. And so what you are getting for climate is that for many, many decades, we've allowed capitalism to run freer than it needs to be. The regulations around pollution and the cost of pollution to society has not been taken into consideration, and that has led to a lot of the outcomes that we are seeing, where profits are going to private ownership for polluting assets that are then causing damages to society. And so through the book, I showcase how you can bring in governments, and not just regulations, but smart regulations, to enable us to finally come up with solutions for solving the crisis, and that business has a role to play in that, but it has to happen in a coordinated way ever more than it has happened in the past.
Thank you. Lynne, I'm interested in your view on that from a slightly different end of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's curious. I grew up in a capitalist country, and I had free education, I had free health service, free university, and there was something called the welfare state. And over the other side of the Atlantic, Eisenhower, a Republican, was taxing business at 90% wealth tax, equivalent of people earning about 10 million today. So you had wealth taxes. The problem is not capitalism or not. The problem is a free market and neoliberal economics, where democracy is no longer a democracy because it's funded by people who want to make a profit. So you have a direct line between corporations paying for the politicians that will maximize their profits. That's not democracy. A functioning democracy is in control of the corporations. So you don't have, and has public goods as public assets. So water companies, whether they're companies or run by the government, I don't mind, but they're not for profits. So that the profits of the water go into clean water as opposed to shareholders' pockets. That's the problem with capitalism gone wild, if you like. It's the problem with neoliberal economics. I don't think we'd disagree with. I don't think we'd be in disagreement about that. It isn't a coincidence that the happiest country in the world is. Does anybody know? For the last 6 years? Did someone say Finland? Yeah, 6 years running, social democracy, progressive taxation, one of the highest rates of taxation in the world, by the way, free education, free healthcare, free universities. Very interesting. So I want capitalism under control. And when we look at models of industry, you know, let's look at John Lewis. I know that John Lewis has had its difficulties recently. Or let's look at the Mondragon cooperative model, 100 businesses across the world. I could go on for hours, but there's a start, okay?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, it's a fair point, which is that we know that a capitalist system can provide benefits, but those benefits, because of the way the economic system works, accrue towards capital owners, and it's the job of governments to ensure that those profits are redistributed in ways that are beneficial to society, and that those profits also take into account the costs of the problems that come alongside the activities that are done, not just the service, right? Clearly, there are services that businesses provide and services we all want. But then there are external impacts from those services sometimes in the form of pollution, and not just greenhouse gases, but, you know, sewage in this country, for example, being dumped into rivers. Those need to be accounted for before profits are allowed to be given.
And I do want to add just an extra point. I think that the other problem with the capitalist model, as it were, is it hasn't yet recognized it's going to happen. I think by not by design, but maybe because there's no choice. There are limits to growth. That you cannot have infinite growth on an infinite planet. I don't know how that is. And if I hear another politician on the radio say, we're going to have economic growth, without saying there are limits to it, I'm going to scream. I'm going to throw the radio across the room because, you know, what grows? You know, what people want to grow is their well-being and their feelings of security and their access. For example, we would love to have growth if it was more access to green space and nature. I'd love there to be more green spaces around this capital growing. What I don't want growing is plastic. There's now more plastic on the planet than people, and it's poisoning us all. I'm a psychiatrist. I don't want to spend a lecture telling you what plastic is doing to your brain or your babies or any of that, but it's terrifying. So we've got to have limits.
That's an excellent point, and that leads me to my next question, which is, we can't have unending growth. There isn't infinite growth. The planet can't sustain it. And the way we measure growth is GDPR-led, which does not take into account nature, the limits of the planetary systems, the resources that we have. How do we transition to that system where those boundaries are taken into account and are factored into the products that we're extracting from the ground, burning, and then throwing back into the ground?
Well, I'll just go back to the point Lynne was making, and just, you know, a logically true sentence does not always compute if it's given as that, right? Which is, yes, there's no infinite growth on a finite planet. That is a logically true statement, except what you need for growth is not just materials, which are finite, but you also need energy, and that is not finite. And so you can have more growth while reducing material consumption. And we've done that in the past because of efficiencies, but even today there is so much scope for us to reduce the amount of materials that we use and continue economic growth. Because the point that Lynne has brought up is an important one to address, which is there is a whole movement as an economic academic section being created on degrowth. And what it argues for is that globally there needs to be rich countries need to degrow because they consume way more than what they ought to on a per capita basis, and developing countries should be allowed to grow. And that would be, if that happens, that would be great. But try and tell Americans to stop driving their SUVs and stop eating their hamburgers, or over here in this country, ask people to give up on everyday conveniences, and you get a politics of degrowth that is too toxic to be able to make change happen. And so what I'm trying to suggest over here is that we should study more and we should try and get people to consume less, and that is a very important activity. But because we are on a deadline that we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible and avoid some of the irreversible impacts that we are likely to trigger because of the amount of warming we have done, we should also pursue activities where we can reduce material consumption. So, for example, only about half of the steel in Europe is recycled. Steel is an infinitely recyclable material. Paper, about 2/3. Glass, about 2/3. There are only some metals like copper that get to about 80% recycling. And so there's so much more. I mean, plastics are absolutely terrible. Single-use plastics, no recyclability, but within recyclable plastics, only 10% are ever recycled. So there's so much material consumption that can be reduced with the technology we have today by driving governments to take on regulations and making companies that produce these goods take responsibility for those goods, that even before we have to worry about the toxic politics of degrowth, we can make lower material consumption for the planet that we live on.
It's more than that. Because if you priced in the damage that is being done, then the goods that we actually don't need and are poisoning us would become too expensive.
Yes, I agree.
So, beef, if you priced in the damage that's done to the environment, people wouldn't have beef. Okay, or very occasionally, small, as when I worked in Bosnia, one family might have a cow or a sheep, one cow. You don't have herds of beef knocking down the forest. If you priced in pollution, as Oxfam reports the last 2 years, I recommend, they're just brilliant, read their reports. Price in pollution, then the fossil fuels, petrol is going to become too expensive and electric power massively, massively cheaper. And what we need to do is pay for the global south to leapfrog. It doesn't, as it went straight to mobile phones without telephone wires, it can go straight to solar power if we give them the money for the technology. But if I could just read Robert Kennedy, 1968, because I just love this. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. Counts air pollution, cigarette advertising, ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts them as growth. It counts special locks for our doors and jails for people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. That's all part of the GDP. It counts napalm and counts nuclear warheads and armoured cars for police to fight the riots in our cities, Whitman's rifle, Speck's knife, television programmes which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit, nor our courage, our wisdom, nor our learning, nor our compassion, nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And that was in 1968.
And still very true today, and even more so. Now, I'm going to pause and just read something that was from Khushwant Singh, who the environment was a subject that was quite close to his heart. And he said, out of love for nature, we cannot remain passive and we must act. Mother Earth is an organism. It lives. She's a source, not a resource that we can exploit. So that, again, very much resonates with what you're talking about, but also there are all these other intangibles which we haven't learned to measure. It's an accounting method that doesn't know how to take this into account. But you mentioned something, Lynne, about, and Akshat, about leapfrogging for the global south into the new world of green technology and clean technology, cleaner air, and all of that. I want to talk about that for a moment because there's the extractive nature of the transition. That's starting a new geopolitical tussle over lithium and manganese and cobalt and all these other new minerals and metals that are needed. How isn't that race to decarbonize sometimes in conflict with environmental protection? And I want to explore that with both of you.
So a few things to remember just from a perspective of decarbonizing. If we decarbonize by 2050, which is the goal that scientists have set, we will reduce the total amount of mining we do by 99%. Because most of the mining we do today is fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are burned and then put up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, which is what's warming the planet. Metals mining will go up. It'll go up by maybe 200 or 300%. So that means there will be more mines that we'll have to go and find. But the total amount of mining falls by 99%. And so on net benefit, the amount of footprint that we have on the planet because of our mining activities will fall drastically. But in places where the footprint will grow, I think we ought to be careful not to do what we've done in the past by trampling indigenous rights, by going into places that are very rich in biodiversity, by having lax environmental rules allowing big mining corporations to go places where they really ought to not go, because there's enough metals we need for the transition in the places that we can legitimately go and mine with concern. And so it is doable. It's a question that comes up as is put as a false equivalence in conversations in media, where you go, electric cars are the solution, but isn't the metals within them not going to make them a good solution? And that has now been very clearly worked out, right? Electric cars, yes, they do take more metals to build than fossil fuel cars, and so your initial footprint of the car is higher. But over its lifetime, an electric car in the UK generates 1/3 the amount of emissions as a fossil fuel car does. Even in China, where the grid is very heavy on coal, it only generates about half the emissions of a fossil fuel car. So those solutions are legitimate, but the deployment of those solutions and the methods used ought to take into consideration more things than we have done in the past.
Certainly, child labour, and you need government control of the corporations that do the mining, that forbid exploitation and trafficking and environmental destruction, and again, making the companies pay for any damage done and having very strict regulation. And I would like to leapfrog over private car ownership, and I speak as an ashamed owner of an old, very battered petrol car, but I know, in case you're wondering, you run your car into the ground rather than just immediately buying. And then car sharing, and, my husband's from Ethiopia, my family live there. I would like to see massive investment in really good public transport already, and it's the Chinese that are doing. There's a train track that runs across the country, and people love it. And if we had good trains, we would take them, would we not? I lived through the 60s and watched all our train tracks being taken away. It's a tragedy.
It is indeed. Thank you for that. I'm going to take a moment's pause, and we're going to go into the audience. We have, so there's this book. We have 3 books today with 2 authors. It's called United We Are Unstoppable, and it's 60 inspiring young people saving our world. And it's their essays and thoughts, this has been edited by Akshat. And we have 3 very kind volunteers in the audience today who are going to read us 3 passages that we've picked. So can I please call upon Raina? If we can have the mic to Raina, please. And then to Augustina. and then Zed.
Hi, I will be reading the words of Aditya Mukherjee, age 16, from India. As a teenager, my main job is being a student, just in case the planet survives and I need a career. But I am living with the climate crisis. Bad farming practices have caused the water table to drop to dangerous levels. The burning of crop stubble in northern India has polluted the air and is causing irreparable damage to citizens, including my family. As one of the world's most populous countries, India will be one of the most adversely affected by climate change. India will have to look at development along with the environment and not at the cost of the environment. Thanks.
Thank you. And over to Augustina there, please.
I'll be reading the words of Twaiwa Hassan, age 21, from Comoros. Comoros is already affected by climate change. The seasons are out of control, species are disappearing, and sea levels are rising. We have the means to fight the crisis, but we are losing the fight. It is as if our house has caught fire, but we are busy filling cans of water with provisions. The biggest difficulty I face as a climate activist is cynicism. Climate change has been politicized, and it is time to find a way to counteract all the damage caused by industrialization, while ensuring that we do so at a pace that will not cause popular uprisings. Young people have enough ambition to search for alternatives, enough strength to withstand the risks, and enough naivety to believe in it.
Thank you. And Zed, please.
He's not a young person.
Thank you. Believe it or not, I'm Emma Jane Burrian. I'm only 18, and I'm from Canada. One of the biggest misconceptions about young people is that we are just smaller, less capable adults. We may be small, but we are certainly not less capable. In fact, we bring valuable perspectives and talents that adults may not have. We hold an essential quality needed to bring about change. We don't subscribe to the business as usual mindset. If I could change one thing about this country, it would be the government's treatment of indigenous people. It shows the government still cares more about money than human rights. It shows why Canada is still so far behind in its climate targets.
Thank you very much, Raina, Augustina, and Zed. I want to use the three readings as our jumping off point to Lynne, how can we make our voices and actions count?
I'm going to ask the audience a question. How many of you here, I ask this question in every talk I give, so I didn't tell you about it, but how many of you here think it's all right to break the law for non-violent civil disobedience in order to bring about political change? I'm just very interested, so it's my little poll. Put up your hands if you think it's okay. Civil disobedience, non-violent for the sake of changing an unjust law. I'm asking specifically about that. If you agree with it being okay, put up your hand. Possibly under 50%. All right. Now, please answer this question honestly. How many of you here have ever parked on a double yellow line? Are you answering honestly? I ask this question because I ask this question at lectures I used to be asked to give at Seaforth College, which is, I used to teach on the counter-terrorism course, believe it or not, in the late 80s, early 90s. And all the officers, including from India and other post-empire places, came to learn about how to deal with terrorism. But for some bizarre reason, they invited me to come along and talk about non-violent disobedience and why it wasn't terrorism. And I would start with this question, and the answer to the first one was 0. No one thought non-violent civil disobedience was okay. But the answer to the second, maybe they were more honest than you, was about 70 to 80% put up their hands. And my next point would be that most of us have broken the law for our own convenience, minor laws, but are very disapproving of breaking the law in order to change things. But I actually think, and I'm going to put this in here, and it's very important to me because it's personal at the moment, that non-violent civil disobedience in a democracy, I agree with John Rawls, can actually contribute to that democracy and strengthen it, because it allows one to hold up injustices or unjust issues to the light of day, either through, as it were, making them visible, or actually showing how the law can be changed. You sit at a lunch counter where you're not allowed to sit at a lunch counter, and you show that no harm is done, but you're breaking the law and you go to prison for it. Maybe that law about segregated lunch counters gets changed. And that's in a democracy. And that's what's been happening with young climate activists, with friends of mine. Tomorrow, 6 doctors, nurses, and physiotherapists, I can't remember all their professions, 6 health worker colleagues go on trial for an action they took 2 years ago when they went to JP Morgan offices in London, the biggest funder of fossil fuels, during a heat wave which we now know killed 3,000 extra deaths in this country, part of 61,000 across Europe, very relevant today. During that heat wave, they wanted to draw attention to deaths caused by the fossil fuel crisis, and the biggest funder. So very politely, making sure no one was harmed, they broke the glass of JP Morgan by little hammers. In case of emergency, break the glass. They had their little emergency hammers. They were all arrested. Tomorrow they're on trial for criminal damage. What's happened to our democracy during those 2 years is that new legislation has been brought in that has increasingly criminalized activists like that and removed the defenses that we used to be using and threatened juries that want to decide, as is their right, and as it says in the Old Bailey, you have the right to decide according to your conscience. It says you can't do that, nor can you hear the arguments put by the activists. Now, what's so interesting, in spite of all those things, is that yesterday some Palestinian activists were actually acquitted by a jury, which has cheered me up. But again and again, the judiciary and the government are clamping down. We can discuss this in the Q&A. But I am really concerned about the space for non-violent protest, both legal and illegal, because the legal is being made illegal, and what's happening to activists in this country. I'm very concerned about what governments are doing. And we need all of us to speak out about this, because if we can't protest, we are lost with the climate and ecological emergency, because this government will not act without pressure, and pressure comes in all forms. So I beg you to educate yourselves, get out on the street and act, talk about this trial tomorrow. I don't know if the press will cover it. It's really important. It'll go on for 12 days. And for me, it's an example of really good, non-disruptive, communicative, direct action. So that's what I have to say.
And it's also not just this country. There is a journalist named Amy Westervelt who's got a series right now on her podcast called Drilled, looking at how governments around the world are clamping down on environmental protests. Amy Westervelt, and she's got a podcast called Drilled. And so she looks at a lot of liberal democracies that are clamping down on environmental protest.
So Akshat, building on what Lynne's been talking about, there are other forms of activism, disruption, so bringing about change and making our voices heard. How effective is shareholder action and divestment as a driver for change? Yeah,
so in the things that can make climate capitalism work, it's not just technologies that make things cheaper, it's not just laws like the Climate Change Act that allow for clear setting of targets and thus government following through policy, but you also need large corporations to be changed. And all of us in some way or another, through our pensions, hold shares in these large corporations. And what has happened over the recent years is that there has been increasingly more agency that we all have to be able to take the money that we have in our pension pots and to direct it to companies that are not doing climate damages, or direct the companies that are managing our money to ensure that that doesn't happen. And that has allowed what is known as shareholder activism to take place, where these pension funds are now going to the annual general meetings of companies like ExxonMobil or Shell but also of like fast mover consumer goods companies like Unilever, and demanding for climate resolutions to be passed, for if the company doesn't have a climate target, to have that climate target, to lay down the ways in which it's going to meet those climate targets. So there's been increasing focus on non-financial performance of companies too, not just the profit and loss, but what are your impacts on society, on environment, on gender equity, on race. And those issues are being brought forward by shareholders. And in many cases, change can happen. So I go through in the book looking at ExxonMobil, which among the large Western oil companies was the least forward on climate, and was forced by shareholders by changing 3 directors to start to disclose emissions data, which it wasn't doing initially, and then set targets. And that battle continues, because just this month, we had an annual general meeting of ExxonMobil, in which ExxonMobil was suing its shareholders for bringing in some of the resolutions, and there was a backlash from some of the shareholders, not a majority, but that battle continues.
Thank you.
Can I come in on this? Because all of you can divest, and all of you, I'm not going to ask you how many of you bank with Barclays, but if you do, move your account. It matters. I tell the story in the book, but I was a very active member of anti-apartheid. Desmond Tutu just pointed out if the climate movement would adopt anti-apartheid tactics, we could win. It matters if it's small, it matters if it's big. I went to Shell AGM last year, I asked a question of Whale, whatever his name. We did an action. Shell are going in the reverse direction, but they're deeply ashamed when their safety officer resigns and publicly goes on YouTube to explain why. These actions matter. When we said to I said, I got paid my first day at work as a GP trainee with a cheque from Barclays, and I said to my partners, my bosses, why are you paying me with Barclays? I'm a member of anti-apartheid. I went, we'll have a practice meeting. They said to the bank, we're moving the bank account. The bank manager came round in a fury. A year later, Barclays had pulled out of its South African arm, having spent the previous year saying how wonderful they were in South Africa. We can make a difference. We really can make a difference as an individual, a company, or as a shareholder. So just move your money. Thank you.
That's an excellent point, and I want to go back to the pensions question. I went through this, been following the Make My Money Matter. It's a fantastic website
Yeah.
and LinkedIn, and just the campaign is so spot on. It really, it hits the nail on the head. I did write to my pensions.
Great.
I did get the responses back. The report that came out comparing all the pensions was, one of them is the best of a really bad lot. So, question to both of you, what if the system is corrupt? Where does one go when there isn't much of an alternative?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with pensions is there weren't any alternatives until recently. So ESG, environmental, social governance, these are sort of the non-financial metrics that are being considered by investors now. That movement is very recent, especially in the financial products that are available. But, as Lynne talked about, if a company, if you quit, you can move your pension. You are allowed to be able to move your pension from a pension provider to another one. And there are now pension providers that would allow you to be able to divest from stocks that you are morally not interested in investing in. So now I don't know if there is a place where there isn't an option. But if there isn't an option, then ask for one, because that's the only way a business would know that's a service that its customers would like.
But what about the state pension?
The state pension nest. So, okay, we'll take this to the drinks later.
Yeah.
But this is quite an important one. But the survey that Make My Money Matter did was about Nest came out on top, but they were still in the red zone, and the others were worse than that. So, and then having written those personal letters, we got the responses back, and there was it did not address the issue, we felt. So I think I totally take your point. We're at the start of that process, and they're now starting to see, stakeholder action and people asking for transparency and accountability, and that's probably the start of that journey, and therefore our voices there as well will matter.
Yeah, I mean,
so we can instigate that change.
This entire movement is very young, right? The greenhouse gas protocol, which is what companies use to report their emissions, was not developed till 2001. even though, we've known about climate change for 50 years, we've had regulations in some form on climate for 30 years, we've had United Nations meetings for 30 years, and yet you only got corporations getting involved later. And it starts with disclosures. Yeah.
Absolutely. So my next question is, are we having the desired impact at the scale and the pace that we need, seeing as we're running out of time?
I mean, no. That's a simple answer, right? We are, the temperatures for May, global temperatures for May came out, and the planet is at 1.63 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial times in the month of May. So it's way past, currently at least on a nominal level, beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal under the Paris Agreement. That is a longer term goal, so there's still, passing it over 1 month does not mean you've actually breached it, but it tells you we're so close to breaching it. And so no, we're not doing enough. And that's the point of the book, which is to say, here are the places where in portions, at scale, things are working. How did China become the world's largest maker of electric cars? How did India learn to deploy solar at scale? And now in India, you have electric two-wheelers really starting to scale up. How did this country become a giant in offshore wind with the help of a Danish company that used to be an oil and gas company but now runs offshore wind called Ørsted? So there are places where large multi-billion dollar, $100 billion companies are starting to change. But the level of change that we need is just so enormous that we need all hands on deck.
Absolutely. So, Lynne, do you want to come in?
No, not on that. There's lots I can say, but give me a more focused question so I don't ramble on forever.
So, perfect. So I have a question about, so I have a friend who's started just last month, launched something called the Centre for Deep Discovery, where he's combining state-of-the-art facilities in education, personal coaching with mindfulness, technology, education, community for leaders in the world. What, in your view, do we need to do to equip our leaders, and I'm talking corporate and political, to invest in that just transition?
So, I can speak from the corporation side, and maybe Lynne, you can take the political side. On the corporation side, what we are starting to see now, because of these pressures from investors, the board, which is the sort of highest tier of management in a company, well, not management, is the owners, a representative of the owners of the company, are now starting to talk about climate issues. And so when the board is interested in climate issues, the management, which is the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, have to answer to the board. And that's happening because investors are demanding for change. Now, most of those CEOs really don't know what they're talking about, but increasingly, because they're being asked these questions, they have to educate themselves on how to deal with these questions. So, and the number of those questions is only going up. You might get a blip here or there, depending on, financial trends or whatnot, but the overall trend is that awareness is being forced on them if they are not already ahead of that curve.
Yeah, I think on the other side, I think we have to get across certain messages and stop the manipulation by politics. There's so much, we have a democratic deficit in this country, and if you're out discussing or canvassing or working for any, I don't care which party, you've got to make sure that all our political representatives recognize this is an issue. And it's more than an issue, it's our survival, which means that our democracy has to be rescued from the corporate stranglehold that corporations have on it through direct funding, which means we have to raise the question of party financing, the way, for example, the Policy Exchange, I think that's the name of the think tank, heavily funded by the fossil fuel industry, heavily funds the Conservative Party. We have to challenge this, because this is leading to the stranglehold that the industry has on politics. And it's not just the Conservative Party. You would know more than me. But it is very, very dangerous, and it will kill us. So when we go out talking to our political representatives, there are things we have to demand. I want a more representative democratic system. We want proportional representation. We want citizens' assemblies that have effect. We want a wealth tax. I'm glad to see that a Blair supporter is today or yesterday's papers saying he supports a wealth tax. We need, as Oxfam says, more money to fund the transition. That money is there. They go on saying there's no money there. There is money. It's in the hands of the corporations. We need a wealth tax to fund the transition. So we should be asking our political representatives to demand that and pushing it. And I look at this audience, you look like eminent academics and intellectuals and so on. You have the power to speak in whatever forum you have access to and talk about these issues. Don't give up, because the younger generation, a few of you in the room, their survival, the survival of my family in Ethiopia right now, depends on this kind of action, talking on doorsteps. Actually, election time is a very good time to start talking about it. Go to these, I don't know if you have them, we have one in Cornwall, where all the politicians turn up and say, what are you doing about the climate? What are you doing about equity? What are you doing about our health? Actually, guess what? They all go together, because a better climate will make us all healthier. Thank you.
Thank you. And you've actually partially answered my next question, which is about democracy and elections. 64 countries are going to the polls, national elections this year. We're partway through that. We should have results from India coming in the next 48 hours. That equates to about 49% of the world's population. It's the ultimate election year. Never before have so many countries gone to the polls in the same year. And they'll be very consequential for years to come. When we look at who to vote for, and you've partially answered that, how should we, as all of us in the audience, reprioritize our selection criteria? What should we be changing in our minds when we're thinking of who to vote for? If we're not, I'm thinking if we're not prepared to change who we vote for, then does this all really matter, or we're just reinforcing the same old?
Well, I would say one thing to think about in political terms is, if you look at the priorities, and I'm taking the average priority of a voter, typically you'll have the economy at the top, you'll have healthcare on the top, and then maybe nowadays you have the climate as a third priority. As Lynne was saying, these are all actually connected, right? Your cost of living crisis here in this country happened partially because of extremely high gas prices. And those gas prices came through because Russia attacked Ukraine. And we know that Russia has also been blocking climate action for a very long time across international conventions. And so all of these things are much more connected than you realize. And so if you care about climate, but others care about the economy, try and combine those two and ask a question that would allow you to ask the politician, how are you going to address emissions and ensure economic growth? Or how are you going to address emissions and lower the bills that we pay on energy? The same thing with health. We know even today, perhaps the greater crisis today, which is so pervasive we don't talk about it anymore, is air pollution. It kills 7 million people every year, 3.5 because of indoor air pollution. Where, in India, even today, you're using wood to be able to cook on stoves, burning wood to be able to have, hot water or cooking in houses. And one way to address that is to give people access to modern energy, which is typically a solar panel attached to a solar cooker, solar panel attached to an induction stove. And those things are now available. A lot of them, the energy that is coming to people who've never had energy is coming in the form of clean energy. And so there are much more, climate is an all-pervasive issue. And so it really, you can use that to be able to raise its profile a lot more than people have thought in the past.
Yeah, 98% of us, everybody in this room, is exposed to toxic levels of air pollution, which are combining with whatever other illnesses you might have to kill you slowly and kill you fast if you're a child living by any of the main roads in London, like Ella Deborah. So when I talk to people about climate change, I say, would you imagine putting the exhaust hose of your car into your car? And go, of course not. I say, well, that's what you're doing. You're pumping this poison into the atmosphere. You are slowly poisoning yourself. And if this was a drug, it would be banned. So it's curious that it's not. But there are alternatives. Clean energy is much cheaper. Wind and solar are much cheaper if we want to make the economy. It's a lie that the Conservatives told us, which means there's a combination we need, which a climate vote, if you've heard of them, from Greenpeace, is pushing, which is that you raise the issue with every MP at any forum that you can, and then they will, if you look Climate Vote online, they will inform you in your constituency which two candidates are the most likely to win, and then ask you to vote tactically. It's not a question, oh, we all better vote Green because they've got the best green policies, because they may have no chance of winning. Vote tactically for the one that's most climate friendly, which in my West Country constituencies, luckily I know he stood, my candidate lost last year by 237 votes because Greens chose to stand. That's their problem. He's more likely to get in and get the Conservatives out. We will vote for him. But in another constituency, it may be someone Green in Bristol or in Brighton, or it may even be Labour. But look at your party, vote tactically, and vote for the climate-friendly person. That is a definite recommendation for the next election. Also, it's not coincidence, and I just want to raise this as a future for protecting democracy. It is not coincidence that the world's least democratic, so-called democratic countries have first-past-the-post systems. Hungary, Poland, UK, the United States, where I'm terrified as to what's going to happen there. I understand India as well. And if you just let me share this little quote with you, because I recommend using it to any occasion. George Washington, a settler colonialist, had something to say about two-party systems. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. And he goes on to say, the disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one against another, foments riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. He could be describing a certain country not so long ago, coming up now. We've got to get rid of it. We've got to get rid of it, and we need citizens' assemblies as well. I hope we work for those. Thank you.
Thank you. I want us to end on a note of optimism.
Yes.
Because it's not all doom and gloom, and we all have a role to play. And I'd like to hear from Akshat and Lynne to read something, to leave us with some hope and positivity before we open the floor up to some questions.
So this is from the last chapter in the book, and I'm going to skip over sections, but it's the story of two women. Sarah Breeden and Farhana Yamin had spent weeks preparing to voice their opinions on an issue they both cared deeply about. Each with over 20 years of experience in their respective professions, they were well prepared to deliver a call to action. But they were about to make their cases in very different ways. Breeden's chosen venue was a conference room in a building in the City of London, the financial capital of the world. My message today is simple, she began at a meeting organized by the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, a London-based think tank. Climate change poses significant risks to the economy and to the financial system, and while these risks may seem abstract and far away, they are in fact very real, fast approaching, and in need of action today. The very next day, just a few miles away, Farhana Yamin decided it was too late to make a reasoned case with the arsonists. She removed the top from a bottle of superglue and squeezed the contents onto her hands. She was standing outside the London headquarters of the oil giant Royal Dutch Shell. Hours earlier, protesters had sprayed Shell New and Climate Criminals on the Portland stone-clad walls of the 27-story Shell Center. The police had arrested 3 protesters, but 2 other activists had managed to climb onto a glass ledge above the entrance and pull the ladder up with them. After hours of negotiation, the 2 finally agreed to surrender and began climbing down from the ledge. Yamin, who wasn't involved in the climate building stunt, used the distraction to make a run for it and ducked under the police tape. A policeman caught her by the right arm. She went limp, and as soon as she fell, with her open palm, hit the floor, she said, "I'm glued to the floor, I'm glued to the floor." A few feet away, her husband Michael and their son Rafi watch Yamin break the law. She's a lawyer, Michael said. She believes in the rule of law, but non-violent civil disobedience at some point becomes necessary.
Thank you.
I'm just going to finish. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sarah Breeden wants to leverage big money to improve our lives and fight climate change. Farhana Yamin wants to change the status quo because something is preventing the world from acting on the challenge. Seen another way, Breeden and Yamin might look like two Davids going up against a Goliath, but in fact, rather than defeating the Goliath, they want to join forces with the giant to defeat an even bigger demon, climate change.
Thank you. Lynne.
So this is from the last chapter of the book. It's called Lifeboats. I live in Mousehole, a small seaside village at the far end of West Cornwall, where on 19th of December 1981, 8 crew members of the Solomon Brown lifeboat gave up their own lives to try and save those of 8 complete strangers. I go past the old lifeboat station from which they launched every time I go to town. It's now a listed building. For more than 200 years, groups of people in coastal communities have gathered together without pay to risk their lives to save complete strangers from drowning at sea. Given a common problem, people will work out how to address it through mutual cooperation by trial and error without the need for externally imposed authority. People can develop complex organizational structures that save lives from the bottom up. I think a lot about lifeboats. They give me hope. The empathy and humanity of those involved and the support that the RNLI has from the public at large was powerfully demonstrated in July 2021, when Nigel Farage publicly attacked it on GB News and Twitter for acting as a taxi service for illegal trafficking gangs. Donations to the RNLI went up by 2,000% in 24 hours, followed by their best fundraising year since its foundation in 1824, and a doubling of their supporter base. RNLI Chief Executive Mark Dowie put out a statement in July 21, making clear that international maritime law permitted and obligated them to enter all waters regardless of territories for search and rescue purposes. Moreover, when it comes to rescuing those people attempting to cross the channel, we do not question why they got into trouble, who they are, or where they come from. All we need to know is that they need our help. Our crews do what they do because they believe that anyone can drown, but no one should. Anyone can drown, but no one should. This is not about globalism or nativism, but humanity. What lifeboat volunteers demonstrate is our ability to empathize and care for others, whoever they are and wherever they are from, and that in the face of impending or actual disaster, we will reach out to save each other. It is the same empathic care for strangers that I have seen in every crisis in which I have worked, not only from volunteers and relief workers, but most notably from the victims themselves. During the COVID pandemic, I heard of refugee women on Lesbos in Greece making masks for local nurses, and refugees in Athens delivering food parcels. I saw it in the networks of mutual support that developed in my own village and across the country at that time. Anyone can drown, but no one should. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could I just say, unfortunately, this book is not available at the bookstall. I'm very sorry.
Sorry for the inconvenience.
Yes, sorry for the inconvenience. Should you wish to buy it, the good news is that if you go online to hearstpublishers.com and take note, write in the discount code SORRY25, you get 25% cheaper than you would have if you bought it here. So please take note if you're at all interested. It's SORRY25, and go to the publisher, not Amazon, not Amazon, publisher's website, hearstpublishers.com. I was allowed to make that advert because the book's not here.
Thank you.
His book is here.
Akshat's book is here, and he'll be available to sign some as well. Would like to take, I'm conscious of time, but a couple of questions.
But we started.
10 past, that's the full hour, yeah.
Okay. Well, I suppose we could,
questions?
I think any brief ones, any burning ones. We have a lady right here and the gentleman here, and then that's a wrap-up after that. We can continue the conversation over tea. How about that?
I just noticed you never mentioned population control. Is this too politically incorrect to do now, or for governments to, or too toxic?
politically toxic, not, that's, it's not something I can answer. What I will give you is the facts as they are. The world population is likely to top out below 10 billion people this year. Total population growth rate is declining, has been falling actually in developed countries. Population has been falling in developed countries. Even in developing countries, population growth is declining. And there is no, within that 10 billion, there is no limit on how we can reach net zero. We can meet our climate goals while managing for that population. So whether it's toxic or not, there are solutions we're going to have to find, and we can find them. That's what climate scientists have studied.
We are going to need more people in this country to take care of our ageing population. Secondly, the answer to population control, is education. So were we to pay for the education, particularly of women, you would have no population problem.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the yellow, please.
Thank you. Just wanted to get your views on a few things that we've known for decades that need to happen but are not happening. For example, so carbon pricing is one. Why is it so patchy? And what carbon pricing or pricing of pollution? So that's one thing. The second thing is stopping of fossil fuel subsidies, massive. Yep. And the third thing is increase of subsidies to drive the green markets. Yeah. So why are these things not happening at the scale?
I mean, I green carded my MP who doesn't even understand subsidies and insists that it's not happening. He's a Conservative. But one is that there is a direct line from that industry. I can talk about the Conservative government here, who are funding them. That is where they're getting their massive donations. It's a matter of record. So they're not going to look at cutting tax breaks rather than subsidies is a better word. The tax breaks that are significantly made and the failure to impose a pollution tax are because that's where they get their donations from.
What is happening is on all those three metrics there's been progress. Most progress on pricing carbon because of a few factors. One, that we understand pricing carbon helps reduce pollution fast, but also because regions like Europe are now putting a carbon border tariff. So if you were exporting into Europe, they will charge you a carbon price if you don't have one domestically, which is making other countries put a carbon price. So China has already done it, for example. On subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies and green subsidies. Green subsidies are certainly rising, and rising quite rapidly. The problem with fossil fuel subsidies is that once they stick, the industry fights tooth and nail to keep them. And so making something new happen is typically easier than taking away support from something old that exists. And so that's where there's the least amount of progress on fossil fuel subsidies. But also those fossil fuel subsidies in developed countries have been falling. In developing countries, they're still treated as an energy access issue. India has actually done quite well on reducing fossil fuel subsidies. There used to be subsidies on petrol and diesel. Now there are taxes on petrol and diesel. So, there are places where you can see progress, but it's not fast enough.
And that's also back to your banking and your pension funds. We're well out of time, so I'd like to say please join me, everyone, in thanking Lynne and Akshat.
Thank you very much to our speakers, and I'm sorry I'm so brutal with timings, but it's to do with getting all of us out of here later today. But there's going to be a 20-minute break now, so I'm sure if you want to speak to our speakers, you can catch them here outside the hall. Thank you very much.